It is officially August, a time when many are reminiscing about summer road trips and planning those last summer adventures, which means it is the perfect time to dive into one of America's most iconic highways, Route 66. Often referred to as the Main Street of America, Route 66 holds a special place in the collective memory of road trips nostalgia and the open road. The route, which ran from Chicago to Santa Monica, has been preserved as a series of state and local roads, and segments can still be traveled. Over the decades, it has been immortalized in song, film, and literature, celebrated as a historic byway, and many towns along the way have embraced its legacy. Route 66 is often celebrated for its scenery and classic Americana, but I do think it is important to examine this conversation and the route through a comprehensive lens. The experiences of different communities along the route, particularly those of marginalized and underrepresented groups, are integral to really understand the full scope of the legendary highway. Not only do I hope this episode acknowledges the challenges faced by these communities, but also celebrates their resilience and the vibrancy and their lives and experiences along the route. And there is no one better to chat about this with than Candacy Taylor. She's an award-winning author, photographer, and cultural documentarian whose groundbreaking work sheds light on important yet often overlooked aspects of American history. She is the author of Overground Railroad, The Green Book, and The Roots of Black Travel in America, which was critically acclaimed by the New York Times, Oprah Magazine, and National Geographic. She is also the curator of a Smithsonian Institution traveling exhibition service, which is touring through 2025. Her impactful projects have been supported by major institutions such as the Library of Congress, National Geographic, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and more. As if that weren't enough, her work has been featured in over 80 media outlets, including The Atlantic, The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Times. Candacy is a leading voice in cultural documentation and historical research. I know I found this to be a very enriching, interesting conversation, and I hope that you do as well. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's silver. Candacy, thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm really excited to chat about this. I'd like to start by just giving you the opportunity to introduce yourself a bit and this particular project that has, I think, also stemmed some other projects off of it, which is very exciting. So why don't you go ahead and start there?
Well, my name is Candacy Taylor, and I'm the author of a book called Overground Railroad, The Green Book, and The Roots of Black Travel in America. And I've been documenting Green Book sites since 2013. Even though the book was published in 2020, as you mentioned, it is still growing, and there's different parts of the project that just keep coming. So it's been in my life for over a decade.
It's incredible. This conversation is Route 66, which, as folks who have just listened to the intro, I've explained that briefly. However, I think it's really important to have this conversation about just not the picture perfect ideals of Route 66 that we all kind of know and hear about, but sort of the shared experience and what that looked like if we're talking about inclusivity. So that's, I think, where your work comes in, right? So could you tell us a little bit, because I think the first thing we have to talk about is the Green Book. So there's a little bit of context for the rest of this conversation.
Right. I stumbled onto this project because I was researching Route 66. So Route 66 is a big part of the story about, how I found the Green Book. I had been commissioned to write a travel guide on Route 66 by Moon, which is, the big brand, Moon Travel Books and Avalon Press. And this was in 2013. And I was the first Black woman to write a major travel guide on Route 66. At the time, I didn't really know that, but when I started doing research and I looked at all the, authors who've been writing about Route 66 for decades, and I met several of them, and they're lovely people, but they were all white men. And when I learned that half the counties on Route 66 were sundown towns, and sundown towns were all white communities, they were all white on purpose. They either would have a sign posted at the county line saying, "Inward, don't let the sun set on you here," or they would have a bell they would ring at 6 p.m. to tell the laborers and the domestics who were Black that it was time for them to leave town because they couldn't be in town after 6 p.m. And when I learned that 44 of the 89 counties on Route 66 were sundown towns, my first question as a Black woman was like, well, how did Black people drive Route 66 during this time when supposedly it was the heyday of, jumping in your Airstream train? It
Americana.
was supposed to be like on the open road and this time of freedom. And it was just incredible to me that, when I looked at the other guidebooks that have been written on Route 66, this wasn't really addressed. So I was living in LA at the time, and there was a exhibition on Route 66 at the Autry Museum, and they had a green book tucked like under glass in a corner. And I'd never known there were Black travel guides. I'd never known such a thing existed. I ran outside, I called my parents, and I was like, do you know about this? And my mother had never heard of it, but my stepfather, Ron, he knew what it was. He was a dark-skinned Black man who grew up in the Jim Crow South in Tennessee. And then, it was kind of the eureka light bulb of just like, oh, this is the project. Like this is, even though I've been commissioned to do this travel guide, and I was honestly doing it for the money because it was just a job I needed, and I thought, oh my God, and like I said, it's been the focus of my life for over a decade now. So it was in 2015 that I wrote an article, the Atlantic article about the roots of Route 66 and Black travel. So that was, then I was off to the races.
It's wild and a bit crazy to me that we don't hear about this, which I think we could, which speaks frankly to much of history. But in particular, I think it is, to this day, it is not the most widely available information when you start research. I mean, even, your own experience, you're researching Route 66, you've never heard of it, and most people haven't. And I think it still kind of speaks to the way that we portray history, nostalgia. We tend to fixate on the pretty parts. And even, like myself, I was initially thinking, okay, great. It's August. It's a good time for road trips, nostalgia. What would be a fun conversation? Route 66 was the first thing that popped into my mind when I started to really look at the history of it myself and figure out like who would be fun to talk about the roots of Route 66 with. When I found your information, my mind was blown, and I knew it had to be you because it's just like, then I feel irresponsible talking about Route 66 and not acknowledging this. Your interest in Route 66, did it initially develop from just getting that book deal?
I had no real feelings about Route 66 either way. I had written a book. My first book was called Counterculture, and it was on the American diner waitress. And I had found all of these wonderful women who were lifers who've been working in diners all their lives. They were in their, they were aged 50 and up. Many of them were in their 70s and 80s still waiting tables, and were just these incredibly powerful and inspiring women. And because I had focused on some women classic diners on Route 66, I guess that got on the radar of, Avalon Publishing, and that's why I was approached to do the travel guide. But like I said, I had no real feelings about it either way. I knew what just as you described, it was this kind of iconic, storied road that, like many things in our country, we gravitate and live in these spaces of exceptionalism in general. I mean, it's no different than what we've already done in so many other aspects, and that are, now becoming a little more interrogated and nuanced, and we're trying to really capture the whole story. And as much as, the Black stories about travel in America, whether you're on a road trip or Route 66 or the Great Migration that was happening during that time, the second wave of the Great Migration was happening from the 40s to the 60s, which was also the height of when the Green Book was in publication from the 1930s to the 1960s. And Route 66 started in 1926. So, and then of course the Depression came. And that's another story that even amongst, the route started out as a cross-country, way to get from Chicago, 2/3 across the continent, from Chicago to Los Angeles, in a diagonal route. It was the only road at the time that did that. So it was really, important for logistical reasons if you want to get across the country. It wasn't a vacation route. It became that later in the 50s.
Right.
But in the 30s, and especially, during the Depression, it was an escape route for business people, men who had lost everything during the Depression, were trying to like find salvation or go to California where there were palm trees and citrus groves, and it was supposed to be the land of freedom. And it was, or in Oklahoma, a lot of the people escaping the Dust Bowl. It was a freedom route to this better land or this better place, which was California. But it was, there were plenty of white people who were struggling traveling Route 66 for other reasons. Of course, for Black folks, most of the struggle was around racism. But, I think the route is just already, like in any other part of how we tell the story of America, is mired in this, exceptionalism and saccharine kind of, memories that don't serve us ultimately, because I think we're a much more interesting country when we tell the truth. And as much as I think it's easy to default on the Black, hardship of traveling Route 66. And we can talk more about, what Black people faced on the road. But it's also a story of resilience and courage, and the fact that you had this travel guide that led Black folks to most Green Book sites were clustered in traditional Black neighborhoods. And it was so much more than just a travel guide. It was like a Black Yellow Pages of all these great independent businesses, mostly run by, a lot of them were run by women, whether there were, tourist homes that were among the first Airbnbs that were run by mostly Black widowed women. There were, barbershops and drugstores and nightclubs and haberdashers and liquor stores and sanitariums, funeral homes. I mean, there were so many things in the Green Book because it was almost a space for entrepreneurship and, like I said, resilience and innovation. And there were these great businesses run by these pretty powerful Black entrepreneurs and everyday Black people who were working in their communities. So I think, when we're trying to focus on these saccharine, stories about the good old days, it's almost like because we don't want to think of anything that we may pose as negative or bad. And that's something we do, every human, as, it's a survival technique. Anytime anything bad happens, and even in our own lives, when we look back on it, sometimes we forget how bad it was, right? Because it's what our brains do. So it's more than, I don't think it's nefarious always that we're just glossing over the realities and the nuanced stories of our history. But it's very important, I think, to realize that when we do that, we skip over the moments of celebration and, empowerment and all these other stories of resilience, in spite of racism or the bad things that happened.
I love that you called it sort of the Yellow Pages, right? Because it did connect. Part of its purpose was essentially to keep people safe in many cases, but it also served that it was a lifeline in more than one way, as maybe what I'm trying to say there. You said something like, was it 44 out of 80?
89, yeah.
counties. So could you talk a little bit about some of those spaces or some of the things that you learned in your research? Some of these locations that had this entrepreneurial spirit, where there was really successful, lovely community taking place.
Yeah, because what's interesting too, just to make a point about the sundown towns before I go into the other spaces, is that there was no map of sundown towns. I mean, we have one now. I mean, it took me 7 years to create a map of sundown towns, and James
Wow.
Lowen's book about sundown towns is really seminal for people who want to learn more about that. But for Black folks traveling at that time, they had no idea. It's not like they could be like, oh, we need to avoid this one or go, you just happened to, hope that you were in the right place at the right time. And it was very easy to not be. So that was the reality of the dangers of traveling Route 66. But once you got to places like, St. Louis, or, there's one of my favorite Green Book sites is this dude ranch called Murray's Dude Ranch. It's in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And it was literally a dude ranch run by a Black couple, and all these celebrities and people would go to it, but also regular folks, kids who were, having trouble in LA would go to the dude ranch, learn how to ride horses, and it'd be this therapeutic place. Lena Horne and others, it was bought by Pearl Bailey. There were these kind of not just safe zones, but these areas of, and not just respite, but of fun and healing, and that have to do with, I guess, when you're traveling, like all those things you want to experience when you're on the road, something new, something exciting. And there was that for Black folks on Route 66, but there were all of these other Black neighborhoods that were very self-contained and self-resilient, and they were not anything like the war zones we see today in some of these communities. I mean, it's pretty amazing. As I've been doing this work for 25 years, and I've traveled over 100,000 miles just for this project. And being in places, and I'm not a fragile flower, I've seen a lot, but being in some of these cities, and I'm not demonizing these places because it's really an American problem. But, when I would go to places like Baltimore and Detroit and Cleveland and parts of Chicago and Miami, one town I was in, and 53 people have been shot that weekend I was in that community.
Oh my gosh.
And that to me was, and I thought this is ironic because this was once a safe zone for Black folks, and I'm doing research on a travel guide that was to get Black people to safe places. And this was not the future that Victor Green, who created the Green Book, or Martin Luther King imagined for our future, right? So that's, I think, something, because they were heavily segregated neighborhoods, but they were so vibrant and self-sustaining because people of all classes within that neighborhood lived there. And so you have Black doctors and Black professionals of all kinds, lawyers and, educators, and there were Black entrepreneurs who were very, very wealthy, and they lived in these communities. And so when integration happened in the 60s, it was a double-edged sword, because a lot of those Green Book sites and businesses that were so, well tended to, and they were so popular, even in parts of, the country where there was real segregation. I mean, a lot of white people want to come to these restaurants or come to these nightclubs because the music and the food was so good, and they would end up getting shut down, or, the cops would come and, arrest people. But they were incredibly vibrant and fun places. And then when integration happened, Black folks who couldn't go to places downtown or couldn't go to the major, all of a sudden those places were open to them. And so they stopped going to these Green Book sites. And it was kind of the beginning of this kind of concentrated levels of poverty and disinvestment from the neighborhoods by the government, allocating resources to other neighborhoods and taking it away from Black neighborhoods. It really did shape the reality that we see today. And, redlining was a big major factor, urban renewal, all of these freeways that went through these Black neighborhoods. There were dozens of businesses that were gone because they were replaced by a freeway. So there were
Mm-hmm.
all these other factors that really shifted and changed, how these neighborhoods operated. And so when you zoom to today and you see this heightened level of violence and poverty, they weren't like that then. That was a sad reality. So in some ways, I don't want to be nostalgic about that either, that, that things were better when we were segregated and had our own communities. But there's something to be said for a time when we were almost left alone to create our own spaces that were, like, again, vibrant and supportive.
Yeah.
So it's a real conundrum. And I think, what you're trying to do with this podcast is interesting because of that. I think it's very easy to fall into those comforts of, yesteryear for every race, and I mean, I think it is what we do. But as long as you have space for nuanced discussions and to really interrogate that, I think it's important.
I agree. And, you're saying that it instantly reminds me, my background is anthropology and archaeology. So I did a lot of study on Native American communities. And so as you're speaking, I'm thinking about a lot of those communities who were doing very okay until others had to stick their hands in and try and tell them how to live. That was one of the first things that popped into my head and that's a whole separate conversation. We won't dive into that, but it just makes me, this is, like you mentioned, this isn't an isolated incident. You mentioned the, freeways, and that was something I was going to ask you about. You can still travel Route 66, just not as it was.
Yeah, no, there were three alignments actually in the original Route 66.
Okay.
Because it was kind of built as one route, but then by 1937, another alignment was added. So parts of, like, New Mexico, US 40 was the later version of Route 66, but the original alignment went up towards Santa Fe.
Okay.
So that's something a lot of people don't know. When you say Route 66, it's like, well, which one? And a lot of times the route was moved even politically, like somebody from a town was a mayor, is like, I want Route 66 to come through my in front of my business. And so it did, so there were those realities. But then by the 50s was when the interstate highway system really became a thing, right? And so
Okay.
a lot of what decimated the Black communities also was the beginning of the end of Route 66, because when the highway system came in, it went through, US 40, right? Instead of these smaller main streets. So if you were on the highway, you didn't get to do the quirky kind of small businesses that really were the bread and butter of those communities. So in the 80s, what happened is Route 66 was decommissioned. The freeway system and all that happened many decades before, and it took that many years for it to really, like I said, it was the beginning of the end, because once you bypass those little towns, if you drive the original Route 66 route now, and 15% of it, when I wrote the book, about 15% of it is just dirt. You can't drive it from end to end like you used to, because
Right.
there's dead ends and there's places where, yeah, it's just dirt road. If you try to drive it now, though, there's still a lot of, and that's another kind of dirty secret that we don't want to really talk about, is the abandonment of these communities, and the state that they're in. So when you have people coming from, like, Japan, who have idolized America, and there's huge Germans, love Route 66, and there's all these kind of broad outreach to these different countries, and when they come and see it, they're like, what? Like, where's Betty Boop and Elvis and Marilyn Monroe and her skirt? That's the shiny, bright kind of pop imagery that we celebrate as the branding of Route 66, and it's not accurate.
You kind of just touched on two questions that I had that maybe are a mesh more than I realized. Earlier, you mentioned how things were changing and communities sort of fell apart, if you will. But that also made me wonder, probably what you're touching on a bit now, is that a lot of these towns relied on the tourism of Route 66 to function. And so then what happens when you do change the route? Even now, there are towns whose income, it might even be 2 months worth, like of their tourism boon provides for that area. And its economy. So can we talk a little bit more about that, or do you have examples of areas or experienced that?
Because there are so many little towns on the way to these bigger kind of, cities. Because if you start in Chicago, literally the 3, 4 towns before you even get to Springfield, Illinois, which is the next kind of place, they were all sundown towns, honestly.
Um,
And then, you would get to these kind of quaint areas that have been almost saved, like Pontiac, Illinois, where they're still they have the town square and they have the pretty, it's like a Norman Rockwell kind of feeling. So
okay.
it's almost like a hyper, and I'm sure it did look like that in the day, but they've kind of it's almost preserved towns in Kansas, which is I think there's only 13 miles of Route 66 in Kansas, but those areas where you see the buildings that are just boarded up and it just looks abandoned. It's like anything, I guess, there's places like Seligman, Arizona, which has become kind of an icon of all these great, that's where you see the Betty Boop and the Elvis, you see all the little Chotsky stores and the barber there, Angel, who was just an iconic barber on the route. I don't know if he's still living, but people would write about him in Germany. They'd visit, and I had the opportunity to meet him, and he was just this really incredible man and an icon of the road, So it's really both and. And I think, again, it doesn't mean that the abandoned places are bad. It's just part of that story, right? And it's like, well, what
Right.
happened? Well, because the freeway really skipped that part of that area. And that's what happens when you don't get, like you said, the tourism that they so desperately relied on and got used to. And, we see that with whether it's the factories, that people in a lot of these Main Street towns, when work leaves, this is what you get. And it's it's a story that happens all over the country for different reasons. So I don't think, and the thing is about Route 66, I don't think it's unique. And it wasn't like the most racist road or anything like that, just because half the counties were sundown towns. I don't think it was any more, special in its celebration and the bad parts than any other place in the country. What makes Route 66, I think, so interesting is that it's celebrated as this kind of iconic, like it's the good old days. And it, even when you think about the song Nat King Cole, get your kicks on Route 66. And, this is a man who in LA couldn't even buy his house in Beverly Hills because they didn't want a Black person living there. It's a very American story, and we want to celebrate in the ways that we keep trying to avoid.
I have not personally driven Route 66. It is on the list. I'd eventually like to give it a try. As far as, you mentioned like the Betty Boop in Arizona having a lot of these sort of emblematic stops. Could you speak to any of those that are along Route 66 to this day? And are there any that have any dedication to the Black communities that were or continue to surround them?
Well, the one that is the most iconic, and I think really on the forefront in terms of being progressive and really telling the real stories about Route 66, is Tulsa,
Okay.
Oklahoma, because the Greenwood District is not far from the route, and it was definitely a big part of that's, of course, where Black folks went. And if your listeners know about the Greenwood massacre, it was horrible. It happened in 1921, which predates Route 66, but this was the community where there were Black lawyers. It was Black Wall Street, which is what Booker T. Washington labeled it as. It had its own bus system and school system and hospital. I mean, it was just really a self-sustaining community that was full of very successful Black folks. And this was kind of a microcosm. There were other Black Wall Streets around the country, but Tulsa was the most iconic one. And as most stories go, a lot of times there was a threat of, a story of a Black young man, a young white woman saying she was attacked by this man. And then there would be a mob, right, that would go out and just try and lynch this man. And in that moment, there was a lot of resentment about the success of Greenwood. And it was the powder keg of it. It was just an excuse. And so this mob situation turned into an incredibly, horrific scene where they literally burnt it down. It was just, and for any of there's a lot of material that's been written about Greenwood District, and because the anniversary was 2021, so your listeners can learn more about the Greenwood story. But what's so incredible about what Tulsa is doing now is they're literally, bringing, they have all of these great parks and things, commemorating what happened, but also there are so many initiatives to find the graves of those who were, they've literally started digging up their past to get to the truth. And when I went on my book tour in 2020, and I spoke to, I don't know, like almost 500 people, at the Historical Society put on a big event, and it was incredible. There were so many, mostly white, probably 80% white audience, but women, white women standing up saying, I've lived here, generations of my family have been here, and why don't I know the story? Tell me more about redlining. I want to learn more about, what happened. And now that, 2021 happened, then more people get to learn about this. But, I think Tulsa is a really great example of what can be done if they want to really just face it. And there's been, so much support and allies on both sides. Black folks saying, we're not blaming white people for this. We want to really kind of examine like what happened. And there's all these opportunities to honor our truth, and I think that it's, like I said, it's just an example of what is possible. So, but there's still a lot of communities that have no interest, in it. And we can't force anybody to look deeper. But I like that, that there are places, there's so many iconic, like Clifton's is at the end of Route 66 in LA. It's like this 5-story cafeteria. It was a Green Book site. It was also unusual. It was run by this white man who was his family, he was a missionary. And when his family took him to China when he was really young, Clifford Clinton, and he couldn't believe that a country as wealthy as America would have people starving, because he saw true poverty, true abject poverty in China. And when he came back to the States, and his family had restaurants and he had a whole chain of restaurants, and this one called Clifton's, and it's on Broadway. It's right at the original it was the original terminus point of Route 66. He just said, I'm not going to charge people for food if they can't afford it. So it literally said on the menu, like, pay what you wish.
Wow.
And some people paid extra, some people paid nothing. There's like, you paid what you felt like the food was worth. And all of his business partners were like, you're crazy. You're never going to make a profit. He made a profit. It was a great, now it's undergone like a $9 million renovation in 2015. And it's just like this incredible place. So I think, there's all these lessons that I think, the stories along Route 66 can teach us, because this idea of scarcity, or that there's not enough, or that it's like we make choices based on reasons that largely have to do with race and class and gender. We just do. We always have. I mean, it's been our story. I think Route 66 has these shining moments of like, well, what if we didn't do that?
That's incredible. Do you know if there still is that concept still in place?
No,
Because unfortunately, scarcity is still a problem.
new owners.
Okay. Okay. Well, I love the idea.
Right.
Do you have any, for anyone who is listening who hasn't traveled it before, do you have any favorite spots or areas along the way that just really you enjoyed that you want to go back to or that you really felt connected with?
Well, like I said, I haven't driven Route 66 in years, as as a road trip. I was on parts of it last year when I was doing some research on the Green Book, but I'm sure Angel's Barbershop is still around.
Interrupting to tell you Google says it is.
And I think that's a really, even just to go and see images of him and the stories, and the walls are really packed with all kinds of interesting stuff. So I would recommend that. There's a lot of quirky things like this bottle forest. Yeah,
Interesting.
that's really fun, and it's in California. If you look up, I'm sure well, I mean, I did write the book. They used all my material because they have to update it every 3 or 4 years. So
And this is your travel guide, your
yeah,
original.
it's a travel
Okay.
guide on Route 66. So of course, Overground Railroad is about the Green Book, which is it's all over the country. And there is a chapter in Overground Railroad called The Roots of Route 66. Avalon, Moon Guides has a Route 66 book that I had written in 2015. I guess they're still using that material. So yeah, I would recommend, just checking that out because there are a lot of quirky, smaller, less popular venue. I mean, of course, there's Cadillac Desert, with the Cadillacs that are Amarillo, Texas. I haven't been there recently. Unfortunately, they're all coated with graffiti, but there's something about when you drive out there and you're walking, you kind of have this walk and you can kind of see these little posts like diagonally positioned in the earth. The closer you get, you realize, oh, they're cars. And then the closer and you can walk around them. And it's kind of like a Route 66 Stonehenge in a way. So that to me was really powerful. And the just flatness of the panhandle of that part of Texas and the landscape is really amazing. And the last thing I'll say is about this is, New Mexico is one of my favorite states to drive through,
Okay.
especially the Route 66 route. And if you take the original alignment that goes up through Santa Fe, just really great restaurants, and just the food and the culture is just so unique to that state. And if you Google that, probably you can find the route. Type in original alignment 1937 New Mexico Route 66 and it'll take you through that area. So I think that's the biggest to me. It's not so much the sites along Route 66 it's the journey, and it's
Mhm.
being in different parts of the country and seeing everything from big cities like Chicago, and then like long desolate plains of the Texas Panhandle, and then driving through. Oh, also Oatman is really a fascinating town, which is
Where
in
is
the
that?
hills. That's in the hills. It's right after you cross the border into between Arizona and California. And they're called the Black Hills, and they had these like tight, and again, you can't take the I-40 route. You have to take the original alignment, but these really tight hairpin curves. It's really a great drive. And then when you get into Oatman, they have all these, and the town was like overrun by these burros, which are mules basically, that were brought there, and then they just kind of kept reproducing. And so these burros are just roaming around the town, and it's so bizarre. And then there's, a great place that, oh God, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's a very small, it's only like a 2 block area, but it's just, it's kind of touristy. But there's a bar that has like money, dollar bills, like all lining all the walls.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, it's so unusual. So Oatman.
I love that quirky element. Like I love stumbling upon even, anywhere, just stumbling upon those little treasure troves of a place. So I'm sure it is lined with all sorts of things. Smithsonian. What an incredible experience. Could you talk a little bit about an offshoot, if you will, of your book? There's an exhibit. So could you tell us a little bit about how that came to be, what the experience has been? I know it travels. I think this is so fascinating. I would love to hear about it from you.
Right after I did the Atlantic article on, the roots of Route 66 and the Green Book, I got a fellowship at Harvard with Dr. Henry Louis Gates, which was, amazing. And we were really trying to sell the book. And in the meantime, one of those kind of pinch me moments when I had been trying, even as early as Counterculture, to get an exhibition traveling with the Smithsonian. So a lot of times when things like that, they're like, oh, how did you just, it's like, it had been like a good decade in the making. Me saying, okay, you don't want to do the waitresses. What about, I did a project on beauty shop culture. And so I was like, what about that? And they're like, no, no, no. And then I thought, well, they're not, it kind of turned away from the opportunity. And they came to me and said, well, we know you're doing this Green Book project, so we think that's really interesting, And so I sent in a proposal and some ideas. And then it started in 2016, 2017. It launched in 2020. And it's a large exhibit. It's 3,500 square feet. It's traveling the US. It's been traveling since 2020. It's been to about 13 venues. It's at the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati right now. Its last major stop, which is the MLK, Martin Luther King Library in Washington, D.C. So that's supposed to be a big venue. So, if any of your listeners can get it to D.C., it's fingers crossed that'll be the one to see. But yeah, it's been a real, gift, I guess, to just broaden the audience in terms of, because there's so many different things like Murray's Dude Ranch, when I was talking about earlier. I went probably 4 times before I find like old, pieces of tile, colored tiles from the kitchen, barbed wire, or, because there's nothing left of Murray's today. But, I'd be out there at 120 degrees, just like, there's got to be something. And there's this incredible Murray's Dude Ranch historian who has been really helpful and kind of sharing that story. So you'll see in the exhibition those artifacts. There's a lot of kind of images of vibrant neighborhoods of Black people dressed to the nines, living a good life. And then there's there's old sundown town signs and things like that. I mean, we don't shy away from telling the whole story. And I think that was a really great balancing act. It was hard to do in the book as well, because there were so many bad things that happened, but also balancing that out with the positives that came from such a horrific situation. So I'm happy to say that the exhibition does that as well. And it's so popular that, we're trying to get a smaller version that will run to, some of the more mid-sized museums, because a lot of venues didn't even get to show it. It sold out it was booked within 2 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, so hopefully, yeah, we're trying to figure out a way to keep it going, but it's so cumbersome now because it's such a big exhibit. But yeah, try and see it in DC.
Is it still through March?
Oh, it'll be in DC on November 3rd, I believe is the date. It's the 3rd
Okay.
or 14th. And it'll go through, I believe, the end of February.
I'll keep an eye on that, but we'll make sure to put that in the show notes, definitely, so people can go take a look. It's also, there is plenty of information online. You've written articles. Of course, you've written the book. I will link that in the show notes. This has just been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I can't encourage people to go look into all of this more for themselves too. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.